been in a couple of these SARE training sessions, and also I've been at the Farm Hub before, last time soil sampling some years ago, and I also go all the way back to the Gill Farm days. Worked with Jack Gill and his family on nitrogen management, sweet corn, and variety trials. So anyway, nice to be back. So my job is to really focus on greenhouse gas management, the carbon footprint of agriculture in relation to soil health and overall agricultural management. And I always like to start with this simple cartoon. It doesn't include everything that we might think of, but a lot of the components are here, and we'll get into some of these in some detail. And the one thing I like to I think everybody knows this, but just to really make sure everybody's got it clear in their mind how unique agriculture is as an industry. Almost every industry today, every type of business, whether out of their own concern about the environment or public relations or regulations, are concerned about their, quote, carbon footprints. And so thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But what's unique about agriculture is what other industry can you think of? I cannot think of one except for maybe forestry, which can actually suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. Natural geoengineering, I call it. So that's what I've got here. The first thing here is in an agro-ecosystem, we have a lot of CO2 uptake. And we manage that very effectively for our food production, etc. So that's something very unique, and we'll talk about that a bit. There's carbon stored in soils, and we'll talk about that. There's CO2 emitted by soils, primarily by microbial activity as organic matter is decomposed. You see some methane coming out here. Methane. So who's producing methane? How's that happening? Why is that coming out emitted from our agro-ecosystems? Livestock?
Anaerobic systems.
In anaerobic systems, someone gets a tip mark little plus there. So we see some, coming out of the cow, but does the cow make methane, or who's actually, there's a partner that the cow has that's producing the methane. Anybody know what they're called? They're anaerobic
methanogens.
Methanogens. Oh, maybe you've seen my lecture. So we'll talk about that. There are anaerobic bacteria of many different species that are called methanogens, and like the name implies, they produce methane in anaerobic systems, and they're pretty ubiquitous. They're very crucial to the digestive system of cows. They do a very beneficial thing in terms of helping them with their digestion. But in the end result is they breathe out methane. They take up CO2 and breathe out methane. Notice we even have some methane coming out from this rice paddy. And the thing that's the same about the rice paddy, the flooded rice paddy, in the gut of the cow is it's anaerobic. If we had a soil that's continually flooded all the time, we would also have methane. If we go to a natural wetland, we could measure methane coming out. All from methanogens. We see the nitrous oxide coming out. We actually have methane coming out from manure, by the way. Wet manure, that's why you want to separate wet and dry manure, because if you have wet manure, it is anaerobic, and you have methanogens going to town. So besides CO2 coming out from manure, you can have methane. Nitrous oxide, where's that coming from? More microbes, right, in the soil and other places. And they're involved in the nitrogen cycle, very important to making nitrogen available to crops in terms of ammonium and nitrate, the form that crops use. But a byproduct of all of that is nitrous oxide emissions. So and there's just a lot of carbon stored in the soils and in the plant itself, and certainly if we have agroforestry or trees, but also in our plants, at least temporarily, there's carbon stored there, etc. Okay, I'd like to start with this. This is just some, very qualitative data from an older study happened to be done in Ontario, Canada, where they actually, monitor the emissions of the different greenhouse gases. The three key greenhouse gases we're going to talk about: CO2, nitrous oxide, N2O, and methane. And the different operations on and this is a mixed crop dairy farm, so very kind of really captures, much of agriculture as we know it in this one farm. And notice the 298 to 1, 25 to 1. We put things on CO2 equivalent basis. Many of you are probably quite familiar with that in terms of looking at greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon dioxide is the dominant greenhouse gas in terms of the quantity being spewed out by humans in general. It's causing our changing climate. So it's put out in relatively large quantities compared to these two, but nitrous oxide is almost 300 times more potent on a molecule per molecule basis than CO2. So when you look at it that way, it's pretty significant, even though it's coming out in trace amounts compared to CO2. And methane about 25 to 1. When you do the quantified thing here, first come to the bottom line, and what I want to point out is it's not CO2, it's not the tillage and the CO2 coming out from tillage, it's not the ruminant animals breathing. There's also, this doesn't even include the tractor driving, maybe that's encompassed in here, but that's a small fraction. It's really much about the nitrous oxide emissions and the methane emissions. That's a big part of it. Nitrous oxide, again, just like the methane in anaerobic systems, tends to be where you see the most. Some of this can come out in some parts of the nitrogen cycle from aerobic activities, but when you have flooded soils, you see much more of this. Anytime you're putting on excess nitrogen fertilizer, poor timing replacement, no or delayed incorporation, decomposition of manure, and manure handling, just like methane here, you see those things happening. And in fact, when we look at the, maybe Harold showed you this yesterday because he was doing a thing on nitrogen management, but when we do the pie chart like this for the US, agriculture overall, and we do it on a CO2 equivalent basis, it's not the tractor driving on farms and the CO2 emissions that's a big part of the story. It's, again, nitrogen fertilizer management and methane, and nitrous oxide, and methane. So actually both of those are very important and really the low-hanging fruit, you might say, in terms of how we look at this. When it comes to like CO2, I mean, agriculture plays a minor role in the global CO2 emissions in terms of what's happening on farms. When you talk about nitrate and methane, though, figures do point at agriculture, and for good reason. A lot of the exponential increase, we've seen an exponential increase in all three of these greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution, which also coincides with a large expansion of population in agriculture. And nitrous oxide and methane are the two where agriculture is the major player in those two. Although again, CO2's the major player in overall global warming that we've been seeing. But when we talk about which components is agriculture responsible for, it's mostly those. So I'm going to spend a little more time on those. So here's the methane and some of the sources of methane. And this is a global analysis, by the way, not a US analysis. And let's just focus on that. So we have agriculture and rice is the dark green. That's the flooded rice paddies. Ag and ruminant animals, this methanogen part of their digestive system, a major component. And the other things are, wet landfills and some other things that does not really point towards agriculture. But these two here, obviously, components of agriculture. And we're not going to talk about rice production today, not very important in New York, but go to a place like China where I've been, and there's a lot of work being done on how can we have less time with flooded rice production because of this methane issue. Nitrous oxide, even more dramatic in terms of the role of agriculture. So there's some other components, but 66% of the explanation for the exponential rise of nitrous oxide in our atmosphere is associated with nitrogen fertilization. So we'll talk about, and that's not only talking about synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, but anything you put in the ground, like manure for providing nitrogen to your crops. Roughly about 1% of the nitrogen that you use for fertilizer is probably going to be lost to the air as nitrous oxide. Okay, I'll take a little time on this slide because I think, particularly for this group in this training session, a little bit of the mechanisms of what's going on with all three of these greenhouse gases is probably worth just making sure you all are coming from the same place and understand. So, first of all, CO2 emissions. You know, we talk about reducing tillage is a major component of how we reduce organic matter decomposition and CO2 from soils into the atmosphere. And what tillage does is, besides breaking up fungal hyphae that might hold aggregates together, which is a good thing, it pumps a lot of oxygen into the soil. This formula here is kind of a generic formula for organic matter. Simple way, chemical way of describing organic matter in general. But the more you remember from your high school chemistry, the more you load up this side of the equation, the more it's going to go this way. The more oxygen you pump into the soil every time you plow and till, pumping oxygen into the soil. This little arrow is not totally a chemical operation, but microbial mediated. Stimulates decomposition of the organic matter, and you get CO2 in the atmosphere. The microbes get the ATP energy out of that. So this is one of the major reasons why too much tillage leads to loss of organic matter. Nitrous oxide. So this biota word here is kind of similar to, we're talking about organic matter, crop residues and stuff. And so we have a group of microbes that will decompose that and end up with a very simple molecule, ammonium, which actually some of that can be lost volatilely, but also, as you know, can be taken up by plants through their roots. Ammonia and nitrate are the two forms that plants primarily are going to take up nitrogen from the soil. So this whole cycle here, as it's represented, is very important and needed for crop production or for natural ecosystems and plants to maintain nitrogen. So we need that, we need this process, but we do lose a little ammonium. This, I'm not writing all the complicated chemistry and all the microbes involved, but there's just a few species really that can convert ammonium to nitrate. And again, this is a good thing. Crops can take up that as well, so both of these are good components. Roots can't take up biota, can't take up raw organic matter, as you know. But you see in this process, we lose some N2O to the atmosphere. And I'm not showing you the chemistry of that, it's an artifact of what we care about, getting things into this form. Then, this is an aerobic process. If we have flooded soils and we have nitrate in there, it leads to denitrification, and again, nitrous oxide is lost in this process. We end up with pure diatomic N2 gas, which goes up into the atmosphere. 70% more of our air is N2 gas, and the cycle can continue if we have legume crops and take up N2 and all that. But you can see two places where the N2O is lost. The nitrate, we normally think about in agriculture historically in terms of soluble forms of nitrate, nitrate soluble form of nitrogen. Besides plants taking it up, of course, obviously it get lost into waterways and be a pollution problem. But this presentation is focusing on this other aspect of nitrogen management and in the environment, and that's the nitrous oxide emissions. Okay, and the methane emissions, I think we already kind of got to this. Anaerobic respiration by methanogen-producing bacteria and archaea. They basically breathe in CO2 and breathe out methane. They get their oxygen, like we breathe in oxygen. Those of you who had some biochemistry, oxygen is part of the electron transport chain of our bodies and plants and all living things. But they strip off that O2, and that's for their electron transport chain. So you don't have to, there's not only oxygen breathers in this world, there's these CO2 breathers, but they give off methane. Anaerobic wet soils, manures, digestive tract, ruminant animals. Okay, any questions about that? Or hopefully it's just kind of, I think you kind of know most of this stuff, but just make sure kind of the mechanisms you understand. Oh, maybe something could not connect to the online sync server. I heard a little noise. Sorry. Okay. Okay. That was the emission on the farm, and most of my talk is focused on what actually happens in the farm gate. But we shouldn't forget, if we're really talking about what they call the full life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas emissions, you will see people talking about, you have to also include the energy embedded in the manufacture of products that are brought to the farm. Okay? So if you are buying, if instead of using organic sources of nitrogen, like legumes in rotation, or manures, or compost, you're going to the Agway or whatever and buying synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, it's about 4 to 6 tons of carbon emitted into the atmosphere per ton of nitrogen manufactured in that way. So, in other words, whether you're a home gardener or someone with a big huge lawn and buying lots of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, or a farmer, that's a big part of your carbon footprint. In fact, some home analyses of the carbon footprint of homes isn't the heating of the home, the cooling of the home, the lights on and off. Homes with big lawns and lots of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, that's the biggest part of their carbon footprint. But, so that's the argument for, while, as I said, even an organic source of nitrogen, if it's put on excessively, leads to excessive amounts of nitrous oxide emissions. But if you're at least using organic sources, you don't have this as part of your carbon footprint. Follow what I'm saying? It's kind of two components to the problem with nitrogen fertilizers. And notice that that fertilizers really dwarfs the gasoline and diesel things. They go off again. I don't know what, why is it going on? I don't see any little thing going on there. So using organic nitrogen sources makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't mean that if I'm an organic farmer, there's no nitrous oxides being emitted from my farm is the key thing here. You know, I'm always using organic nitrogen. Still, even if you're an organic farmer, you want to be judicious in your application of organic nitrogen sources. So bottom line here, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, if that's what you're using, are very energy intensive to produce and have a whole carbon footprint to them, just before it even gets to you. All nitrogen fertilizers, including manure and other organic sources, give off nitrous oxide as they degrade in soil. It's part of a normal microbial decomposition process that we're happy goes on, very important to crop production and natural ecosystems, but it does have that offshoot. And nitrogen management is often inefficient. Of course, you put on too much nitrogen. And there's been some interesting studies done lately measuring these nitrous oxide emissions in fertilizer trials, where they're putting on everything from suboptimal, this is on these studies were from the Midwest and done on corn production systems. And you can see there was a whole range, and it was over several years. And suboptimal nitrogen rates, optimum nitrogen rates might be around here, let's say, nitrogen fertilizer application rates. But you can see there's an exponential rise in nitrous oxide. And if you think about the gap between, where you might be here under optimum for maximum yield, you might be here. But farmers who put on excess, oh, what the heck, just to, just in case I have a rainfall or something, you can see the magnitude of nitrous oxide emissions is much bigger here than if you over-fertilize a little bit here or under-fertilize. So dramatically, the more you over-fertilize, once you reach that yield plateau, if you're putting on excessive nitrogen beyond that, nitrous oxide emissions start to go to the roof, to be kind of dramatic about it. And Harold talked to you all about adaptan yesterday, I'm sure. So just another argument for using this. He probably focused a lot on the nitrate story and the yields and all that, but nitrous oxide also very important to that.
I'll just add really quick with that adaptan. Back to that other previous slide, Harold did some modeling with adaptan and found the same thing to happen, that when you apply excess, that it's exponential losses.
Yeah, so I guess Harold's done some work on this. This is a work from
somebody else.
Phil Robertson's group in at Kellogg Station in Michigan. Okay. Anyway, all of this stuff that we talk about so much here, reducing tillage, winter cover crops to keep sucking out CO2 from the atmosphere and getting it into the soil, applying organic matter or even biochar, perennial systems where you disturb the soil less, increases resilience to drought and flooding, but also storing carbon in the soil. And where would that be? Organic matter is normally about 60% carbon. That carbon, if it wasn't in the soil, would be in the air as CO2. And this is where I think Agriculture as an industry, the only other industry that really is like it is forestry, where you actually can claim, you can actually compensate, you might say, in your head in terms of doing the calculation. I've got so much greenhouse gas emissions, but I've got this carbon sequestration thing as well. And there's a lot of people in Albany right now, and at the national level and international level, interested in working with farmers on building organic matter in soils for this aspect, and possibly even incentivizing soil health practices, simply because of their interest in this off-farm benefit of sequestering carbon in soils, the whole carbon farming thing. I want to talk about, this is kind of, the slide has a number of bullets, and I'll go through them one by one. There's a lot of ways of linking soil health and greenhouse gas mitigation. Now, I just talked about the carbon sequestration piece, but we'll talk about, and I mentioned a few others, but I want to kind of summarize them with this slide. It's a bit lengthy, but you'll have a PDF of all these slides, I'm sure. So first of all, this is particularly relevant in some developing countries. So countries where they're not using a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, that's not the big part of their pie chart in terms of their carbon emissions. But in a lot of developing countries, there's shallow tropical soils. They can easily get depleted of organic matter, and it leads to kind of a chronic, then moving to the next piece of forest, cutting that down, and expanding agricultural land, deforestation, because the land is becoming depleted. So working with the farmers in developing countries, like in East Africa where I've done some work, there's a lot of work on soil health from the standpoint of keeping where you're farming today healthy, high organic matter, so it's not going to lead to you very quickly within a few years having to open up new land to expand production. Healthy soils have better drainage and better water holding capacity, both, because it changes the porosity of soil and leads to benefits in both ends. And so if a soil has good drainage, it's less likely to be anaerobic, and therefore, the quiz would be, what greenhouse gases do we reduce in emissions? Nitrous oxide and methane. Maintaining year-round vegetation cover, which is part of soil health, increases CO2 uptake, and some of that gets into the soil, and it increases our carbon stocks. So that's the carbon sequestration piece. Maximizing reliance on nitrogen fixation from legume cover crops, which is also often promoted as part of a soil health package. Reduces the need for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, improves nitrogen use efficiency, and can reduce nitrous oxide emissions. In general, when you have a farm that's been well managed for some years in terms of healthy soils and other ecological approaches to farming, you can end up with a situation where you require fewer chemical inputs, and every one of those chemicals has a manufacturing carbon footprint with it, so it adds to that thing. It could be less synthetic fertilizers you have to apply, but also less pesticides, etc., and so reduces that part. Reducing tillage frequency, of course there's just tractor driving with tillage, so that alone reduces fossil fuel emissions from the tractors. But more importantly, as it decreases that rate of organic matter decomposition, you're not over-oxygenating the soil, so more carbon stays in the soil as organic matter. So there's all of that as a multitude of benefits. So that's how they are linked. Any comments or questions about any of that? So one big challenge with this realm of soil health, and especially when we get into this thing of carbon farming and all of that, is the challenge of actually monitoring what's happening. If we're actually going to incentivize, for example, farmers to adopt soil health practices because they'll be able to sequester more carbon in the soils, how do we verify that? And there's a lot of complications with all of that. And my group and some others has been involved. I was involved in a USDA NEFA project some years ago, looking at new carbon, nitrogen, and greenhouse gas management strategies. Actually, DAPDN was part of that, and Harold Van Ness and my group looked at a lot of things associated with the carbon piece of that. This is a map of, just based on USDA NRCS soil survey data, an estimate of soil carbon stocks across the U.S. You can start with that. Of course, if you want to get down to the nitty-gritty of a particular site on this map, It may not match exactly what the soil survey data say, so it's not good at that resolution, but it does give you a picture of where some of the big carbon stocks are. And we certainly do rely on that as a starting point for thinking about baseline data on soil carbon in a farming system. If we want to monitor soil carbon change as farmers adopt new practices. So that's a big challenge we still have today, is getting just the baseline data. I mean, we have questions from Albany coming now. What are the carbon stocks about New York soils? How much carbon are New York soils storing? And it's like, okay. I'm leaving that to Peter Woodbury at Cornell. He's kind of a modeler, and no, it's really difficult. You can think about, carbon sampling. I mean, soil sampling to get at it. This next thing here, can you guys see this picture clearly? It's two soils, exactly the same. This picture here, the one on the right is darker, the one on the left is lighter. These are exactly the same soil types, same moisture content. Which one would you guess has more carbon in it, intuitively?
The one on the right.
The one on the right? Aha, your eyes can see carbon.
I showed that picture yesterday.
Oh, did they? Oh, fair.
Sorry to
So
say
that's a
that.
VNIR spectrophotometer reading. Did they talk about the VNIR on the go apparatus? So this is the visible near infrared.
Yeah,
Huh?
yeah.
Stonehouse.
That's Stonehouse did.
Oh, so okay. So this is the spectrum from a visible near infrared. So we're looking. My group's looking at both mid infrared and visible near infrared. And yeah, so if the naked eye can see that, you can imagine when you look at a whole spectrum, the kind of specificity you can get. There's still an issue. Somebody's still got to go out there and dig the hole or something, and that's a big cost, and it's very cost prohibitive in terms of doing this. So that's a big problem. There is this equipment called on-the-go VNIR. It uses a VNIR spectrophotometer mounted on the back of a tractor with tines that go about 4 inches into the soil, racks through the soil. The tines have fiber optics. Each tine has a fiber optic. Did you guys hear about this already too?
Never saw one.
We saw it.
Yeah.
It was electric
No, we
conductivity.
can picture it very well because we saw it yesterday.
Well, and so it flashes light down in the soil, collects the reflected light instant by instant, and you can program it to get meter by meter or whatever you want in terms of the mapping of the soil carbon in the soils. It only tells you about the upper profile. So a big problem is how deep do we go to monitor our soil carbon stocks? And in this big study we did, when we were looking at this, we were going down 75 centimeters to 100. But we really saw, still, a lot of the action is in the top 30, 40 centimeters. And what we can do is use models to look at it for different regions. And of course, it would vary almost farm to farm, but certainly region to region, soil type to soil type, trying to predict lower layers of soil, what their carbon would be from what you get from upper profiles. So if you did some experimental work at the onset of this sort of work, you did this shallow sampling and got detailed carbon data and the shallow profile, but at selected sites you went deeper and monitored what the carbon was there, and then looked for a way of developing an algorithm for predicting the lower depths from the upper depths. You could then use that in the future to predict a deeper profile from a shallow soil sampling. So that's another strategy. The reason we're going into this is that there's a lot of interest, as I say, in beginning to monitor this. And the problem is it's cost prohibitive because of the expense of soil sampling and measurement. The other thing is this mid-infrared spectroscopy, once you kind of do the initial experimental work where you take a lot of samples and you do this spectroscopy and you do the wet chemistry in the lab, doing it the old-fashioned way to analyze carbon, you then again have an algorithm, and so in the future you just can use the mid-infrared spectroscopy, and it's much cheaper. You can do many more samples in a day than going through a lot of wet chemistry. And actually, with one of my grad students in his last part of his PhD thesis, documented a much lower error rate, actually. I mean, it's easier to train someone to simply take a mid-infrared spectroscopy instrument and flash a light on 100 soil samples in a day than it is to teach someone the complicated chemistry of measuring carbon the old-fashioned way. This next thing is talking about using geostatistics for for improving spatial resolution with minimal sampling. So it gets kind of back to what I was talking about here, where you identify by looking at the topography, different aspects of spatial differentiation in a field in terms of various aspects that might affect carbon deposits. And you do some initial work to get at the spatial variability of a particular field. You can minimize the number of samples you need to take. You know, if you took an old school soil scientist and a field plot the size of this room, how many soil samples would it take to get an accurate soil carbon measurement? They might say 20, 30, you know, it's so variable. With this, you can end up with coming up with a reasonable, a little lower precision, but depending on the purpose, if you just want to look at soil carbon change over 5 years or whatever, you can reduce that number dramatically. So we're doing a lot of work on that, the geostatistical tools. And finally, looking at models. So this is the DaySet model. Some of you may have heard about it. It's been around for about 20 years. Very sophisticated model. Models all kinds of aspects of, so you can take a particular field or a region and have some estimate of the soil practices they're using in terms of reduced tillage or not, cover cropping or not, get some idea of the organic matter inputs, and then this also models on a day-by-day basis based on soil temperatures and moisture, the rate of decomposition in the soils and how much carbon's going in and how much carbon's coming out. And you can use, this can be used to actually predict soil carbon change once you get some baseline data. So modeling is another, no sampling involved. So there's a lot of tools. This Common Farm was another one of our partners besides Harold Van Ness. A guy, Keith Poshton at Colorado State, was part of that bigger project, and he's kind of the lead designer of this tool called Common Farm, which has embedded in it that very complex simulation model called DaySet that can predict carbon change on farms once you put in the right baseline data. It's being used now in California on a statewide basis, looking at their estimates of if we got so much of our agriculture to shift to these kinds of practices, how much carbon could we gain in our farm soils over time. Very complicated stuff. Big error bars around what it comes up with. Actually, I think still, it still is the modeling work. But it's some of the better things we've got. We've got other things about. I know that PepsiCo, for example, is using the Cool Farm tool. So they're a big international food production company, and they produce frito-lay potatoes and other things. They're interested in, just kind of from a PR standpoint and other reasons, interested in the carbon footprint of everything they do. And so this you can put in, it's again kind of crude, but you can put in information and get some idea of the greenhouse gas budget of your farming system. The USDA has developed a pretty sophisticated dairy model, and it keeps getting improved. So for dairy systems that include things like manure management and the methane from cows and all of that, these things are out there. So I've just got like 5 minutes. Where am I at?
You're okay.
So I just have a few slides quickly kind of talking about another angle to mitigation on the farm, and that's thinking about reducing the farm energy needs off the grid. That might involve a coal-burning power plant or whatever, or gasoline use or something, to basically grow your own energy or compensate, reduce some of your energy needs from the coal-burning power plant by a wind turbine, etc. So renewable energy on the farm. And I think this is something, this and energy efficiency are two places where I think farmers are very, open to ideas about this. I don't know any farmer out there who's not kind of interested in the concept of renewable energy and energy use efficiency, just like homeowners are, from the bottom line kind of perspective. So it's not like you have to, this is a good place to approach farmers about greenhouse gases in the farm. It's talking about energy use efficiency and this aspect of it. I think even farmers who are not very concerned or don't even want to talk about climate change, this is a place, I've been in Iowa, corn, soybean guys, wind turbines everywhere. A lot of biofuel crop options out there. I notice all of these are non-food crops. You might I'm teaching a class right now on climate change and food security. We get into all this stuff. We talk about biofuel crops, come up to that discussion. We talk about, you know, it's a great concept because instead of taking carbon from deep in the earth, fossil fuels, bringing it up into the atmosphere, burning it, and then it's part of our climate system now for 100 years, those CO2 molecules stay up there for about 100 years. If we allow these plants to suck up CO2 from the atmosphere and we burn them, they all give off CO2, but this is recycling CO2 that was already part of the atmosphere. So from a theoretical standpoint, biofuel crops, I'm all about them in terms of us part of the solution to climate change, because it's recycling carbon that's already up there instead of putting new CO2 as a burden to all of us for many years to come. But it doesn't matter what you grow, where you grow it, and how you grow it. So the key things here are, if you're using corn or other food crops, there's an issue with corn food prices, competition of land, and all that stuff. Of course, we have more, you could argue we have some things like corn food production is high, and we may not, we were just talking about that earlier. Maybe not competing for prices. The other thing is where you grow it, not on optimal food crop land. So thinking about biofuel crops that can grow on more marginal land, so we're not stealing land. We have a big challenge ahead of us in terms of food security for finding land for crop production. And the other thing is how you grow it. So if you use a lot of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer to grow corn for ethanol, there's been a lot of studies showing that corn ethanol is a total bust in terms of helping us with climate change. Because you can totally outweigh the benefit of using corn. This CO2 gets sucked up as a fuel if you're using a bunch of CO2 taken from fossil fuels to fertilize the crop. So where you grow it, how you grow it, and what crops you use, etc. So these are all non-food crops. So just kind of a summary slide here. Improving farm energy efficiency is one thing. Again, you know, something that I think it's intuitive for just about everybody. And so farmers have always been about this. One reason farmers went to diesel engines many years ago is diesel is much more energy efficient. Thinking about energy intensive inputs, using renewable energy sources, including anaerobic digesters and dairy systems. And a big one, as I said, I think kind of a low-hanging fruit in our world. A lot of farmers, excessive nitrogen, and a lot of stuff that probably Harold talked to you about yesterday. Also manure management, storage and handling associated with that. And reducing tillage, this is all the stuff we talk about with soil health. All of that is good for sequestering carbon in soils. And then in the developing world, this is more of an issue. A lot of deforestation because soil's not being taken care of well, and then deforestation escalating. And thinking about expanding agroforestry actually in our agro-ecosystems here, because those are perennial plants that store a lot of carbon and the soils aren't disturbed. Finally, this is just two different reports in fairly prestigious journals have done global reviews of the potential if we took our current agricultural lands and we did all the things we know to do, how to do them right, to maximize carbon sequestration and reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. We could offset 1/4 to 1/2 of annual atmospheric CO2 emissions for at least 2 to 3 decades. It does kind of fade after 2 or 3 decades if we really did this, because the organic matter in our soils worldwide would begin going up to a place of where it's hard to build up more. Soil Health Partnership, some of you may have heard about that. That's about 12 states in the Midwest, Corn Growers Association, but also Nature Conservancy, Monsanto, Cornell University, and other universities involved. And they're very involved in soil health and some of these things, New York Soil Health. This was something introduced at the Paris climate meetings a few years ago, the COP21. This is talking 4 per 1,000 is basically 0.4%. If we could increase 0.4% the organic matter of our soils, we can make such a huge impact on climate change. So I'll leave it at that.